America faces a big choice on November the 5th.
And we who believe in reproductive freedom.
He says, you're not going to be a dictator, are you? I said, no, other than day one.
Perhaps the most important election in recent history is too close to call. But whatever happens on election day, and in the weeks that follow, the America that we thought we knew is gone, and it isn't coming back.
It's the enemy from within, all the scum that we have to deal with.
Join me, Dr. Emma Shortis, on After America as we discuss the final weeks of the campaign and how this election will change our world forever. After America is brought to you by the Australia Institute. Subscribe now, wherever you get your podcasts.
The challenge for Australia, irrespective of whoever wins the US election, is to recognise that we do have a lot of power, that power is deeply relevant to the long-term interests of the United States, and that power gives us agency to impact modestly but effectively on how the United States thinks about itself. And I reckon that's not bad.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows. I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day, and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains economics, politics and policy in plain English. I'm your host, Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute. Australia's relationship with the United States is built on shared values and in a fundamental belief in the institutions of democracy. But American democracy has been having a pretty tough time of it in recent years.
And now I want to hand it over to the President of Ukraine, who has as much courage as he has determination. Ladies and gentlemen, President Putin.
Who hides evidence? Criminals hide evidence, not honest people.
He says, you're not going to be a dictator, are you? I said, no, other than day one. We're closing the border and we're drilling. After that, I'm not a dictator.
Let's have trial by combat.
The Supreme Court has continued to take away long-established freedoms and norms, including a woman's right to choose, and now threatening the fundamental American principle that no one is above the law.
With polls about to open as we record this, US democracy itself may hang in the balance in what's been described as one of the most important presidential elections in generations. So at this critical moment, we thought it was time to consider our own relationship with America. And there couldn't be a better person to join me in the studio to do that. I'm joined today by International and Security Affairs Advisor Allan Behm. Thanks for joining us, Allan.
Good morning, Ebony.
Before joining the Institute, Allan spent nearly 3 decades in the Australian Public Service. He was Chief of Staff to the Minister for Climate Change and Industry, Greg Combet, and Senior Advisor to then Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs, Senator Penny Wong. His latest book is The Odd Couple, The Australia-America Relationship, which was published this year and longlisted for the Australian Political Book of the Year Awards. Congratulations, Allan.
Thank you again, Ebony.
Thanks so much for joining us. As we've seen over really the entirety of this election campaign, and perhaps before that, American democracy has really come under enormous pressure in recent years. Part of that is obviously a result of the direct threat that Donald Trump himself presents, and partly due to a failure to address some of the long-standing, institutional and societal problems like racism. And you've written a lot about that in your book. So why should America's domestic challenges matter to Australia?
Well, I think for every reason, just about. America is a critically important country in the world. It is inherently rich. It is inherently well endowed. Its population is one of the most creative populations in history. It's a highly dynamic society. It's a society that really does know how to produce things, and it's a society that's got an inherent capacity for leadership. So for all of those reasons, it matters to everybody. With respect to Australia in particular, America and Australia share very, very much a common heritage. We don't think about it all that much. America was settled 3-4 centuries before Australia was, and we've been barely going for 250 years. But as I try to point out in the book I published this year, Australia and America as a pair probably began in about the 13th century, when the agrarian reforms took place in Britain and suddenly people became superfluous to farming. And what that did is lead to the slow build-up of villages and then towns until we get 400 years later into the world of the Industrial Revolution, and suddenly we've got cities. And with cities come unemployed people, comes crime, comes transports to different countries, first of all America and then Australia. So both of us are inheritors of a long period of economic development in Britain, and we should never forget that, because along with that, we brought a host of really fundamental cultural and social institutions with us. So there are probably no two countries which are more similar in the world than Australia and America. And I include New Zealand in that too, because New Zealand have been able to deal with their original inhabitants in a much more sophisticated way than has America or Australia. So in a way, New Zealand's a bit ahead of both of us. But putting that to one side, Australia also is a richly endowed country, and hence the alignment between the two of them.
Yeah, that's interesting, the distinction you draw with New Zealand. I would also say they've managed to strike a bit more of an independent foreign policy on things like nuclear issues, for example, as well, which we might come back to a bit later in the conversation. But you do write in The Odd Couple that America and Australia need each other for their own success. And lots of people in both countries probably may really scoff at the idea that Australia matters much at all to the United States. So can you tell me a little bit more about what you meant by that?
Well, we all know that Australia sees itself as being a dependent of the United States in most respects. Particularly, the security relationship is a relationship of dependency, and it has many of the signs of Australia being a kind of defence acolyte to the United States, signs of sycophancy, and signs of what P.J. Keating called the cringe.
Nowhere land of the early 1980s with a dependency on commodities that wouldn't pay for our imports. This is the golden age. This is the golden age when vast numbers of Australians never got a look in. That the women who didn't get a look in and had no equal rights and no equal pay. Where migrants were factory fodder. Where Aborigines were excluded from the system. Where we had these xenophobes running around about Britain and bootstraps. And that awful cultural cringe under Menzies which held us back for nearly a generation. That awful cultural...
We find it very easy to defer to the United States because it has so much military power. But that's only a very, very small part of the story, actually. And in the most fundamental sense, the Australia-America defence relationship is the consequence of that deeper relationship. That is a relationship between two quite powerful countries which have a capacity for very considerable agency in pursuit of common interest. And that is a powerful thing to have. So for Americans, on the other hand, they're full of their own myths. We're afraid of abandonment, as Allan pointed out. We're very conscious of our insecurity, and we have been since 1788. You know, for the first 2 years of white settlement in Australia, we were deeply worried about where our next meal was going to come from. So we've had in our DNA this sort of security and abandonment thing. Americans really haven't had that, and certainly not since 1776. So Americans see themselves as being exceptional, as having manifest destiny, of being indispensable, to use Madeleine Albright's expression. So for the most part, they don't give a second thought to anybody else in the world. But when they do give a second thought to others, it tends to be their enemies in the first instance. And so they think a lot about China at the moment, and they think a lot about Russia. They used to think a lot about countries in South America, that they had the Monroe Doctrine to deal with that. But they don't actually think all that much of their friends and allies, and when they do, it's in the context of perhaps Donald Trump thinking of NATO and dismissing it. In fact, dismissing it to the extent that President Macron described NATO as being brain dead. The Americans now, though, are going through a very important period of what we might call ressentiment, of thinking about their position. They're wondering why they've reached the point that they have reached, massive debts, social dislocation, the return of real problems of racism, massive economic insecurity and inequality, and beginning to think much more about who in the world would help them. And so you find that a country like Australia, with the very strong institutional and structural alignments between the two, is coming more and more to front of mind. And that actually, I think, works to America's advantage, but it also works to Australia's advantage.
Again, I might come back to that, but I did want to pick up your comments around the defence relationship becoming, a result of some of that shared history that we have. And defence has obviously been a major part of the relationship since World War II. And front of mind for many is really the AUKUS agreement and the $368 billion submarine deal. And you wrote in The Australian last week that 3 years on, there's still no compelling argument, strategic or otherwise, for Australia acquiring 8 Virginia-class nuclear-propelled submarines. Why are we doing it, Allan?
I think we're doing it for a kind of political shock and awe. There is no doubt in my mind that for Prime Minister Morrison, AUKUS was a stunt.
To meet these challenges, to help deliver the security and stability our region needs, we must now take our partnership to a new level.
The UK, Australia and the US will be joined even more closely together, reflecting the measure of trust between us, the depth of our friendship and the enduring strength of our shared values of freedom and democracy.
Thank you, Boris. And I want to thank that fellow down under. Thank you very much, pal.
A massive political stunt, and it certainly shocked and awed because nobody could see it coming, least of all the people who were running what was, we understand, an ongoing and reasonably successful project with the French on a diesel-powered version of their Barracuda submarine. Now, we had senior naval officers giving testimony at Senate estimates just in the weeks before this amazing announcement was made in Britain. So I think the real reason was Prime Minister Morrison seeking to capture the high ground in the lead up to the election of 2022. And I think he did. I think he captured that high ground really, really well. The problem with it was that while he was capturing the high ground, he also created a fundamental wedge for the opposition. And instead of flicking the wedge out to the boundary for the time being and coming back to it after the election, the opposition decided that it wanted to kill the wedge completely by accepting the fait accompli. Of course, what it did was wedge itself internally, so that you have, at the moment, very, very strong internal opposition within the rank and file of the Labor Party against AUKUS, and an executive which is paying no attention to that, but is pressing ahead regardless of any advice, any reason, any rationale, or indeed any deep analysis of either what do we need by way of submarines to defend Australia and how much are we prepared to pay for them. So those things are still up in the air, and in my view, they'll stay up in the air forever.
Yeah, because defence, and again, you commented on this in your piece in The Australian, it's almost unique in that it virtually gets a blank check to do whatever it's like, which, of course, not only comes with the actual cost of an arrangement like this, but also the opportunity cost, as you point out, for almost every other domestic program, Medicare, aged care, all kind of fighting over the scraps or fighting for every last dollar that's required to fund them. And defence itself, it currently operates, I think, a fleet of ageing submarines, the Collins class. And ABC is reporting that only one of them is fully operational at the moment. I mean, given we're already facing delays and workforce shortages, something that seems to plague the United States as well, how is Australia going to deal with the more complex nuclear submarines, even if we eventually receive them? Is that even a realistic prospect given the limitations within America and its own workforce and ability to produce these submarines?
Look, Ebony, I think we'll deal with it with maximum difficulty. It's a kind of analogy to Prime Minister Turnbull's snowy 2.0. The overhead battery driven by water that's going to come flowing relentlessly down the hill and provide everybody with electricity at, what was it, $2.5 billion? We're now talking something closer to $30 billion if it ever comes off. And so I think what is driving the AUKUS thing from the point of view of government is that Australian people have been conditioned to be fearful. We know from our own polling here at the Australia Institute that Australians are actually more fearful of China than the people who live in Taiwan are fearful of China. And that's extraordinary. I mean, what do you put that down to? And for my part, I can only put it down to the fact that the Australian electorate has been conditioned to fear China by repeated claims that China is going to invade us and claims that have been pumped up by journalists in the Australian media who really should know better. So I think that lurking in the background to the whole of the AUKUS thing is racism, because it is directed towards China. It's that insecurity that comes from being a long way from anywhere. That was the insecurity of the First Fleet. It comes from a lack of confidence in ourselves. And it also comes from the fact that we as a nation find it very difficult to self-affirm, that we still rush off to the United States, Harvard or Stanford or Princeton, or Great Britain, Oxford, Cambridge, and if we're not rich enough to go to those, we might like to go to King's College in London, to become sort of affirmed as a culturally strong and thinking nation. So we're sort of caught on our own petard, so to speak, that all of these pathologies, as I tend to call them, combine together to make us sitting ducks for the kinds of blandishments that might come from a country like the United States or Britain if they want to flog nuclear-powered submarines to us.
I mean, you've talked about the fact that Australia matters, that we do have and should exercise our own agency. We're still a very big economy. But do we really have any options around AUKUS? Do we still have a choice about how we engage with it?
This is a pretty tricky question, I think. Good defence planning, and I do know a little bit about it. I did spend a long time there. Good defence planning will always contemplate a plan B. What happens if? The contractor might go broke. Circumstances might change. There might be really pressing issues around skills and expertise. All sorts of things can intervene to make any given project difficult. I mean, just in the last week, we've had two $7 billion projects change. We had a $7 billion project to acquire long-range missiles, which will go 1,000 kilometres. And on my calculation, that's 1/6 of the way between Australia and China, but let's not mind about that. We'll find a way of making them go further by stationing ships much closer to China, I expect. But at the same time, we had the cancellation of another $7 billion project, which was a geostationary orbit defence communications system. Now, that one has probably been cancelled because we've got newer technology at lower cost. I suspect that that's the reason for it. And good on them, but it makes my point for me. that circumstances change as much as everything else. So looking again back to whether we have options for the Aukus submarine, the answer is simply no, because all of our eggs at the moment are in the Virginia-class basket. In fact, however, there are other options, and most particularly the French Barracuda option, because the French Barracuda submarine is an excellent submarine. It's one that we could potentially build. It's much smaller than the Virginia class, which I think suits our water conditions around Australia better. And so long as we are able to have a properly constructed and, shall we say, somewhat more robust and a bona fides agreement with France, I think that France and Australia could be quite good partners for a nuclear-propelled submarine if we were to take that fairly critical decision.
Presuming France would ever speak to us or trust us on a contract again, I guess.
Oh, look, we drink plenty of French champagne. I think they'd sell us a submarine.
I mentioned earlier I wanted to come back to New Zealand, Allan. I kind of briefly alluded to them charting a bit of a different course on nuclear issues. They're very strongly anti-nuclear, of course, stemming from the French bombing of the Greenpeace boat. But in one way, that has really led New Zealand to very much strike its own path on something such as that Australia feels like it doesn't quite have the confidence to do itself necessarily, because we do seem to rely so much on the United States and more recently the UK again. And you've also talked about, Allan, that we should look to Asia more for charting a bit more of an independent path when there's two superpowers who are, contesting a space. What can we learn from New Zealand and our closer neighbours when it comes to dealing with big superpowers and charting our own course?
Well, New Zealand, of course, is able to leverage its greatest security asset, which is its isolation. It's a long way from anywhere, and it does use its isolation to great effect, and that is what Longy, when he was Prime Minister, was able really to do. He was able to say to the United States, look, we don't need your nuclear weapons, we don't need your nuclear-powered ships and submarines, because who is going to want to come all this way to take over a pair of islands? Australia's not in quite the same strategic circumstance. We do have distance as one of the fundamental elements of our security, and we don't think about that nearly enough, I think, in Australia. It's a very difficult place to get to, particularly with weapons.
Yeah.
And we are. Actually,
lots of people as well.
We're inherently secure. And particularly if we focus on our proximate defence rather than imagining that we've got to defend ourselves in Beijing or Moscow or London or somewhere else. So we can learn from New Zealand to the extent that, yes, we're a long, long way and that works to our advantage. But different from New Zealand, we actually have a very significant amount of power, and that is what is most useful to the US. We dissemble about our power and we say silly things like, we're a middle power nation and, we fight or punch above our weight and all of those silly things that we say. I mean, anybody who tries to punch above their weight will be flattened. That's the nature of boxing. So you shouldn't even use the expression because it proves that you're an ignorant twit. But we have a lot of power in Australia. We're the 12th biggest economy at the moment. 8 of our universities are in the top 100 in the world. That is extraordinary. 4 of our cities are in the top 10 cities for amenability. And even in things that really and truly matter, like how we do in the Olympics, we come number 4. So, and that is actually, it is a very, very clear sign of power. We're a first world country that can afford the price of Olympic medals. That's what that really means. They come in at about $15 million each. And we don't even know where the money goes. We don't even care enough about that. What matters to the United States right now is to have powerful countries as its allies. And that is where our agency comes from. So the challenge for Australia, irrespective of whoever wins the US election, is to recognise that we do have a lot of power, that power is deeply relevant to the long-term interests of the United States, and that power gives us agency to impact modestly but effectively on how the United States thinks about itself. And I reckon that's not bad.
I want to think now about the potential consequences of the US election. We don't yet know which way it will go. Perhaps we might have a better idea by the time this goes to air. But there's obviously, well, maybe it's not obvious. There's going to be differences in the US approach to AUKUS and perhaps to China, depending on the results of the presidential election. How do you see those two pathways unfolding?
Yeah, that is a very difficult question, I think, because it's my feeling that the fundamental problem with AUKUS is an achievability problem. I just don't think it's achievable. Whether it were Kamala Harris or Donald Trump, neither of them, I think, would be able to deliver much in the 4 years of their presidency, and in the successor presidencies, I'm not sure that they can deliver much either. But I think as between the two, of course, there are quite stark differences of style and temperament. And it does appear, Ebony, that there is a sort of a late drift towards Kamala Harris from what one can tell. Sort of informed commentators just over the last 24 hours say they are detecting such a thing. And if it does happen, there are, I think, a number of consequences. So maybe I'll just touch upon a couple of them very quickly.
Yeah, please.
First of all, I think that if Kamala Harris were to win, there would be effective continuity in US foreign policy. It would not be different, I think, from that of the Biden administration. She will find it very difficult to end the war in Gaza between Israel and the Hamas and Hezbollah. And that, I think, is essentially because the United States is largely locked in to supplying Israel with armaments. And it would be difficult for her, I think, to turn off that tap. I think the war in Ukraine will continue to go badly for everybody, and that includes the United States because it's a long war now. It's an intractable war. And it is very unlikely that Ukraine, even with the assistance of the United States and the Europeans, can actually defeat Russia. So Russia could keep it going for quite a long time, or Russia could decide to be decisive. Either way, there's little way out, I think, for a US president, be it Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. If Trump becomes president, well, I think it's sort of all up for grabs. Trump is very much more transactional in the way in which he deals with things. He's much more likely to want to do deals, as he did in his last presidency.
Much more admiring of dictators on the whole?
Strong men, Ebony. Far be it from accusing Donald Trump of being enamoured of dictators, but he does seem to like strong men, whether they're Little Rocket Man or Putin or even Xi Jinping. So I think he sees himself as being a sort of a natural dealer with those sorts of people, and will look to negotiation and transactional behaviours. That will be bad for the United States because he will resort, I think, to tariffs. That will be bad for Australia and bad for the global economy. By and large, I think that a Trump presidency would be not in the interests of anybody. But I think the more significant thing out of this election could well be whether women begin asserting their real political power in the United States. And I don't think this is just a Roe versus Wade issue. I think the US has been poised, that's women in the US have been poised to play a much more active role in the economy, in politics, in everything in the United States for some time. And I think it's just possible that the moment has arrived, even if Trump wins. So maybe if we have a very significant turnout of women voters, and our colleague Emma Shortis is actually in Philadelphia right this moment in huge queues who are getting out there to vote, and they're women. And so if that's replicated at all, not just in Pennsylvania but across the United States, I think we could have a very different America. And God only knows, do we need it? Because America is broken and it does need serious repair.
Yeah, it's interesting. The Iowa polling numbers over the weekend showed that particularly amongst women, I think age 60 plus, there was something like a 2-to-1 for Harris compared to Trump. So if that's replicated, in any other of those swing states, it'll be very interesting to analyse those results and where that late swing has kind of come from. And in a way, Allan, I feel like that's happened in Australian politics as well. At the last election, we saw a lot of independent women elected to the Australian Parliament on the crossbench. The Labor Party has got pretty equal numbers in its representatives. Liberals falling way behind, but it does seem to be like it's been a recent trend here as well, which is interesting and brings me back to Kamala Harris. What do we know about what her foreign policy would be if she's president?
She hasn't said a lot about foreign policy issues. I think she will be a conservative foreign policy person. She's evidently been talking to Hillary Clinton, so she will have quite a few ideas, and I would expect will rely on Hillary Clinton a fair bit, just for her expertise, first of all, but also to have another woman within earshot. I think that's a pretty important thing. She's also a Californian, which means that she is more likely to look west. I think her foreign policy will be one of a much more considered engagement with China and with East Asia more generally. I think certainly with Japan and with South Korea. I think that they're two very important both domestic communities for the United States, but also foreign policy targets. So I think we'll see a much more deliberate and measured approach to Asian foreign policy on the part of Kamala Harris. And of course, she will be much more inclined to reinvest in the State Department. In my experience of the State Department, it's a very strong department. They recruit really brilliant people into the American Foreign Service. But over recent years, their foreign policy has largely been Pentagon-led, I think. And that has not worked well for the United States because they reach for weapons before they reach for their brains. And that's not a good thing for anybody.
Mm. Coming back to Trump one more time, you talked about how transactional he is as a person, I guess, as well as a president. But his presidency was also marked a lot by unpredictability in particular. Do you think we'll see the same from him this second time around? And your observation that a lot of the responses in terms of foreign policy are now Pentagon-led versus State Department-led. Do you think that those institutions, I guess, that underpin the presidency are strong enough to withstand, I guess, a second Trump presidency where he's very clearly indicated he wants to take a kind of a more authoritarian approach, shall we say?
Well, that sort of is the big question, isn't it? I think there are a couple of different aspects to that question, and I'll deal with the more proximate one, what's going to happen now, and then perhaps with the consequential one. I remain very concerned about what will happen in the next week, win or lose. If Trump does lose, I think we could have sporadic violence in the United States. Very, very difficult to predict exactly where it will be and what form it will take. But we know enough about the internal workings of the United States and about the deep social divides in the United States to recognise that in many of the red states of the United States, those who might seek to resort to violence, particularly armed violence, will implicitly be supported by the police departments and the people in the police departments, that the division between the law enforcement agencies and the rioters may not be a very marked one. The law enforcement agencies could feel either sympathetic or compromised. I think that's a very significant danger. Some people imagine that the United States could return to the sort of 1850s, 1860s and have a civil war. I think that's impossible. But anarchy is not impossible. that smaller groups of armed men driving around in their pickups, flying Confederate flags, looking very nasty and wearing balaclavas is really a possibility. And we would have seen just in the TV footage over the last 2 days the fencing off of Pennsylvania Avenue with spiked barriers and all of that sort of thing for crowd control. I think that the law enforcement agencies are very much aware of the potential for violence. Looking, though, to the deeper problems of the United States, unless women do really take their own authority into their hands, I mean, one of the things we were talking about earlier was the things we've got in common with the United States. And one of them, I'm afraid, is a very deep structural misogyny. And we know that in Australia, and it's certainly evident in the United States. If women start addressing that, if women start exercising their power, their political power, economic power, their social power, I think the deep fault lines in the United States may be susceptible to a bit of remediation. If that doesn't happen, then the consequences of a Trump presidency will be very profound, and the United States, I think, its problems will deepen. If Harris wins and she can get across the first sort of couple of months to inauguration and calm the place down, have Trump accept the outcome and disappear off to Mar-a-Lago and stay there forever, the United States, I think, will have a chance of remediating its problems. So here we've got to again distinguish between hope and optimism. I think we should all be hopeful that the US can address its problems, but I'd love to see some early signs that make us optimistic that it will do so.
Thanks so much for joining us on the show today, Allan.
A pleasure, Ebony, as always.
And congratulations again on your book being longlisted for Australian Political Book of the Year awards. That book, again, is The Odd Couple. You can find it in all good bookstores. And we would love to hear your thoughts on the show today. You can reach out to us via email at podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au, or you can find us on Twitter at the Oz Institute. That's with an AUS. This was recorded on the 5th of November, and things have almost certainly changed since recording. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ebony Bennett. Thanks for listening.